Okay, welcome to another broadcast of the North Carolina Masonic Research Society. Tonight we are thrilled to have with us Right Worshipful Brother Mike Jarzabek. Mike was raised in Connecticut, but he is a member of several Massachusetts lodges, including being past master of Brigham Lodge in Ludlow. He's a member of Ezekiel Bates Lodge in Attleboro, and I think many of us here are familiar with Ezekiel Bates and the Masonicon that they host every year. The Meadows Lodge in East Longmeadow, Ancient York Lodge number 89 in Nashua, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts Lodge of Research, where he's currently the senior warden. He has also served as Junior Grand Warden for the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts and is currently serving as the chairman of the Lodges of Instruction for the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. So we are thrilled to have Mike here. I mean, his Masonic resume just goes on and on and on, but just a very impressive brother, very knowledgeable, and just love hearing him speak. So Mike, we are just thrilled you're here tonight, and whenever you're ready, brother, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. What are you guys seeing for a screen share? Are you seeing the presenter's notes or are you seeing the actual presentation?
The actual presentation looks like.
I never know. There's so much going on with these Zoom things with trying to do the presenter thing, so just want to make sure. Yeah, so thank you for having me. This presentation, I've been giving it for about a year and a half now. I first gave it in South Pasadena at South Pasadena Masonicon in July of 2019, and it's progressed from then. And actually tonight you're gonna see some. I was contemplating some of it, and I added some material tonight that's never been in it before. So I hope you guys all appreciate it. So this talk's inspired by Joseph Campbell's 1949 book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. As such, it's an exploration of the various stages of the hero's journey, its mythological roots, Masonic exemplifications, and the practical application of the useful art by the contemplative man. We learn from the Kybalion that the possession of knowledge, unless accompanied by a manifestation and expression in action, is like the hoarding of precious metals, a vain and foolish thing. Knowledge, like wealth, is intended for use. The law of use is universal, and he who violates it suffers by reason of his conflict with natural forces. This talk can really be distilled down to 3 simple words, so if you leave here with nothing else tonight, I hope that you leave here with this. Be a hero. We have a tendency in these times and in this fraternity to consume. Like an all-devouring scythe, we cut down our knowledge, yet leave it to rot in the fields of our mind, never putting it to good use. We learn of symbology, philosophy, and mythology, yet rarely speak of truly applying these things to our lives. Sure, we might do so in a superficial way. We might post an aphorism on Facebook. Deep and philosophical truths and ancient mysteries become mere bumper stickers or tattoos on our soul. In Freemasonry, we're introduced to dozens of characters. Some of these characters we're introduced to directly and some indirectly. Each and every character, however, whether big or small, whether identified by inflection or by reflection, demand our contemplation and application. It's our responsibility and our birthright as Freemasons not only to hear and see the truths taught by their story, but also to smell, taste, and feel them. Well, how do we do that? We do it by the power of story. But what's a story? The word story comes from the ancient Greek word historia, which means knowledge from inquiry, to judge or inquire. Inquire is based on the Latin quaerere, which means to seek. Seek and ye shall find. The online etymology dictionary defines find in part as to discover, obtain by search, or study. So story, in its definition, invites us to contemplate. There are many specific literary devices employed in the telling a story. Chief among these is allegory. But what specifically is an allegory? An allegory is defined by dictionary.com as a representation of an abstract or spiritual meaning through concrete or material forms, a figurative treatment of one subject under the guise of another. The Encyclopedia Britannica tells us that allegory, which encompasses such as fable, parable, and apologue, may have meaning on two or more levels that the reader can understand only through an interpretive process. Reading a story is an active process. It isn't just about an intellectual understanding. To truly read, we have to fully interact with the text. The same goes for ritual. When done correctly, Freemasonry is an experiential activity. When done correctly, it is an ordeal of the mind, the body, and the spirit. When done correctly, it's a journey both within the tiled lodge and without. Think about all the ways that time is represented and alluded to. The 24-inch gauge, the hourglass, circambulation, the tender leaves of hope, and winding stairs are just a few. In those separate symbols and phrases, we find a common thread. Through the transmission of them, whether as a ritualist, a candidate, or as a spectator, we're taught tangible, spiritual, or tantric practices like visualization, movement meditation, and the use of mantras. We also find specific literary references. Who recognizes this part right here? So farewell to the little good you bear me. Farewell, a long farewell to all my greatness. This is the state of man. Today he puts forth the tender leaves of hopes. Tomorrow blossoms, and bears his blushing honors thick upon him. The third day comes a frost, a killing frost. And when he thinks, good easy man, full surely, his greatness is a ripening, nips his root, and then he falls, as I do. While some of you might recognize that from some of our ritual, the quote is actually from Henry VIII by Shakespeare. These words are spoken by Cardinal Wolsey, and Cardinal Wolsey is a man who has acquired his station as an advisor to the king by deceitful means. Eventually, his dishonesty is discovered, and this speech is him talking about the nature of power. If this is a literary reference, then maybe it has a hidden meaning. So what is that meaning? Is this an allegory? And if it's an allegory, what part? Is it the tender leaves of hope, the frost, Cardinal Wolsey himself, the entire piece? What is this supposed to tell us? More importantly, what are we supposed to do with the information? Do we just admire it and those clever enough to hide it in plain sight? Do we simply take it at face value? Is this literary reference used by Masons merely because it sounds nice? What is the context to all the other parts, and what's its relationship to the whole? How would we apply this to our lives in a meaningful and a practical way? Likely the astute would understand that in this soliloquy, Cardinal Wolsey speaks to the fickle nature of power. To further explore this, though, let's compare and contrast a couple of our Masonic heroes. We all know the stories of the main characters of our ritual, but let's discuss some of the minor, more unlikely characters. What do we know about Jephthah? Jephthah was born to a prostitute and was cast away by his half-brothers. He soon took up with outlaws in his exile and became their leader. His original home, Gideon, was under attack by the Ammonites, and the leaders of Gideon came to him to ask that he lead their army in battle. He agreed to do so, but only if they would name him as the permanent leader of their country, which they accepted. He made an oath to God that if he was successful in battle, he would sacrifice as a burnt offering whatever came out of his door when he returned home. He defeated the Ammonites, and as he returned home, his teenage daughter rushed out to meet him. He explained his predicament to her. She made some convincing arguments as to why he didn't need to follow through with his vow, and he accused her of making a semantic argument. In the end, however, she freely accepted her fate on the condition that he allow her 2 months in the mountains with her friends so that she may weep for her virginity. He allowed her this time, after which he sacrificed her in accordance with his oath. You may be thinking that I'm telling a part of the story that doesn't really apply to our ritual, but let's consider that last part. Could his daughter be the virgin weeping with time's hand enfolded in the ringlets of her hair? Whether you think so or not, how would that change our understanding of this symbol if we did? Even deeper than that, though, how does the story make you feel? What would you do if you were Jephthah? You believe in God. You've made God a promise. Could you break the oath that you made? It's a very explicit example, but let's think about it in a more subtle way. Have you made promises to yourself or to others or to God? If so, have you upheld them or broken them because they were too difficult to bear? The Talmud points out that Jephthah made a rash vow without truly considering the consequences or the laws. The Midrash tells us that as a punishment for his actions, he started to lose limbs, one at a time, and they were buried in the towns where he lost them. In the end, he served as leader of a small town in the Middle East for a mere 6 years in return for his sacrifice. Did you consider the consequences and understand the terms of your oath? What were the consequences of honoring it? Did you lose anything? If so, what did you lose? And what did you get in return? And do you think it's worth it? Did you break the oath? If so, what were the consequences of doing that? Jephthah's a classic unlikely hero. Born to a prostitute, cast away by his brothers. This is a classic literary motif of which King Arthur, Oedipus Rex, and Joseph are all similar examples. But let's explore another unlikely hero from the Bible. How many here know the story of Boaz? We learn in the book of Ruth of an 80-year-old man named Boaz. This man was a rich landowner, and one day he happened upon 2 widowed women named Naomi and Ruth who were gleaning in his fields. Naomi was Ruth's mother-in-law, and Ruth, a Moabite, refused to leave Naomi by herself and returned to her homeland after her husband, Naomi's son, died. In this time period, if a man died, his closest living relative was required to redeem his wife. What this meant in practice is that he would buy his lands, marry his wife, and any children conceived would be of the deceased relative's lineage. Naomi came up with a plan that Ruth should sneak into Boaz's tent at night, lie with him at his feet, and convince him to redeem her. That evening she did just that, but unfortunately Boaz informed her that while he was willing to redeem her, there was another closer relative that had the right and responsibility. In the morning, Boaz went out to meet this man and explain the situation. This man deferred to Boaz rather than lose his ability to continue his own line, and to seal the deal, as was customary, he removed his shoe and gave it to Boaz as a testament to their agreement. Boaz and Ruth were then married, and after consummating their marriage on their wedding night, Boaz died the next morning. The child that Ruth gave birth to 9 months later was Obed, who was father to Jesse, who was father to King David, who was father to King Solomon. And generations later, as a result of their selfless act, Jesus was born. Was Boaz a hero? I mean, he did get to sleep with a woman half his age, so I guess if he is, then that's some kind of sacrifice. I mean, sure, he died the next day like a praying mantis, but I'm pretty sure he died with a smile on his face. And if we believe the artist that has this last picture, he did. 2 minor characters in separate parts of the Bible. What moral lesson are we supposed to learn from all this, from this inclusion in our ritual? The explanations we receive at face value aren't very deep, but these are allegories, so by definition, they really shouldn't be. We learned earlier that we can only understand the meaning of an allegory by active interpretation. So in doing that, we have to ask, could their deeper meaning be understood by interpreting them as one? What if we compare and contrast them? What do we learn? We know they both deal with the idea of sacrifice. The Macmillan Dictionary defines sacrifice as to give up something important or valuable so that you or other people can do or have something else. Jephthah does this. He sacrificed his only daughter. In practical terms, this sacrifice brought an end to his line. Boaz sacrificed his wealth and his lineage. Boaz represents a particular kind of sacrifice. He represents redemption, which is similar to ransom. To redeem or change, a price must be paid. With those definitions in mind, what do we see? First, Jephthah made his sacrifice without understanding the law. If he had, he would have known that sacrificing children wasn't allowed. Second, He sacrificed something undefined. Sure, it was his daughter in the end, but when he made the deal, he didn't really know that yet. For all he knew, it could have been a dog. Jephthah was dishonest in his obligation. He also let it be left a chance. He wasn't actively making a choice. He displayed what's known as the external locus of control. Finally, Jephthah made this deal simply to obtain earthly power. Boaz, on the other hand, only sacrificed what was his to give freely. He gave up the material for charity or love. So in both stories, we have this idea of sacrifice. And in both stories, the sacrifice involves a woman. Could there be an allegory deeper than simply sacrifice? What other similarities do the stories have? Jephthah fights the Ammonites. Ruth is a Moabite. What else do we know about these two groups of people? In Genesis chapter 18, we meet Lot, who was a nephew of Abraham. He followed Abraham on his travels until the group got too large and started squabbling. They agreed to separate, and Lot left to go to the area around Sodom. Sometime later, God visited Abraham and informed him that he was going to destroy Sodom for being wicked. God agreed at Abraham's request not to destroy the city if he could find within it 10 good men. In chapter 19, two angels visited Lot in Sodom. He showed them hospitality, but soon a violent mob arrived outside his door wanting to, quote-unquote, know the angels. To placate the mob, he offered his virgin daughters to be raped in the angels' places. Most of us know the rest of the story. The angels safely escorted the family out of the city, which was promptly destroyed. Lot's wife didn't listen when she was told not to look back, and when she did, she was turned into a pillar of salt. But let's fast forward a little bit. Lot and his two daughters were hiding in a cave in the land of Zoar, which was spared to destruction. Fearing that they were the last humans on Earth, the girls devised a plan to preserve the human race. They got their father drunk on 2 successive nights and laid with him. Each later gave birth, one to a child named Moab and one to a child named Ammon. These children's descendants were known as the Moabites and the Ammonites. So both Ruth and the Ammonites are Lot's descendants, which ties together the story of Jephthah and Boaz. What theme can we find in these stories? Each of these stories deals with sacrifice and or redemption, but they also center around the sacrifice of redemption or women. Could this in itself be yet another allegory? When a feminine character is sacrificed, what exactly is being sacrificed? Likewise, when a feminine character is redeemed, what exactly is being redeemed? Carl Jung spoke of the anima and the animus. He defined the anima as the unconscious feminine side of a man, and the animus as the unconscious masculine side of a woman. He didn't mean this in a sexual or physical kind of way. In fact, they don't necessarily correspond to a person's specific physical gender. He looked at them only as mental archetypes. Masculine mental energy in that idea is that of strength, logic, and will. It's represented by the right side of the body, and to the Greeks, this was corresponded to the Doric pillar. Feminine mental energy is that of love, caring, and receptiveness, and it's represented by the left side of the body. And to the Greeks, this was corresponded to the Ionic pillar. When brought together in a healthy manner, these form a sort of marriage. When one develops feminine mental energy in direct proportion to the masculine energy they're born with, they complete themselves. Likewise, when one develops masculine mental energy in proportion to the feminine energy, they also complete themselves. As I stated earlier, this isn't dependent on physical gender. It's not a discussion about that. There are men and women that are born and raised with either or the other energy. What's important is, regardless of which energy you do have, that you have the goal to develop its opposite in an equal measure. The idea of harmony or balance transcends the work of Jung. The concept is found in diverse yet similar ideas, such as the mosaic tiles in our ritual, Aristotle's golden mean, and therefore the 4 cardinal virtues, the Kabbalah, and the yin and yang. If we accept this idea, then we can look at the sacrifice of a female character as the cutting off or dismemberment of the feminine aspects of self. In cutting off the feminine aspects, we are denying ourselves the opportunity for openness, caring, and love. Cutting off aspects of ourself is a psychological process that humans go through called disintegration. We cut off healthy parts of ourself to protect us from the external threats to our security. We see evidence of this concept in victims of abuse, soldiers, and prisoners. In therapy, the goal is to achieve reintegration or balance. So let's look at those stories again in this light. Jephthah didn't need to fight the Ammonites. If anything, they were just a version of himself. They were born from sinful means. In defeating them, he basically defeated himself. He did this simply to gain acceptance from those who had cast him aside. He probably should have been fighting for the Ammonites. As an outlaw and a soldier, he typified the masculine ideal. He had a chance with his daughter to live forever through his lineage and through her innocence. He had the chance to find balance. However, he was a broken man, and despite being offered multiple chances, he sacrificed that most important to him for temporal power and acceptance from those who hurt him as a child. How many of us have ever done that in our life? If there were any question whether or not this was the lesson that we're supposed to take from this story, we just need to think about the penalties. Jephthah disintegrated. He lost body parts which were then buried. What other stories do we know with penalties such as these? In the end, he did all of this to remain in power for a mere 6 years. We should note that 6 is often mentioned as the numerical value for man or the flesh, and is sometimes also known as the value that represents the soul. At its simplest, the story of Jephthah is a story of disintegration or destruction. In comparison, we have Boaz, who was under no obligation to redeem Ruth. In doing so, he freely sacrificed his material or temporal power in exchange for love or charity. Even their child Obed is not his own. He received nothing in return. That is, unless we count the wild night with a woman half his age. However, as a result of this selfless act, he allowed a line of kings to be born into the world. As the story goes, the last of these kings would go on not to redeem merely a woman, but to redeem the entire world. Boaz reintegrated the feminine aspects of receptiveness and caring, and in doing so, he changed the world. At its simplest, the story of Boaz is a story of reintegration or creation. But what then of Lot? He offered to sacrifice his daughters, but in the end, it was he who was sacrificed. He was robbed of his strength by that which he almost sacrificed. This resulted in a continuation of his lineage, but through sinful means. It was only through the later redemption of Ruth that this was healed. You might be saying to yourself that I'm overthinking the whole thing. The ritual tells us what these stories mean. The Bible tells us what these stories mean. Why do we need to dive any deeper? Ask Jephthah, ask Lot. If they had understood the stories that they had been told in their time, maybe their lives would have turned out differently. These parallels would be amazing if just taken at this level, but they aren't just biblical. In the lodge, we see symbols such as the cornucopia, wheat, or corn, and the pomegranate. In the ritual, we're taught their meaning, but could they have a deeper meaning? These symbols are associated with Demeter and Persephone. We know of these characters through the ancient Greek religion. In these stories, Persephone was playing in a field and she was noticed by Hades, the lord of the underworld. Hades, having to stay alone in the underworld to judge souls, was lonely. He asked Persephone's father, Zeus, for her hand in marriage. Zeus gave his blessings, but Hades knew that Demeter wouldn't allow it. She had forced her daughter to remain an innocent virgin. Hades knew that Demeter would never allow him to marry Persephone, so he kidnapped her and brought her back to the underworld to be his bride. Demeter was distraught and searched everywhere for her daughter, and under stress, the land suffered from a horrible drought, and nothing grew. When she finally found Persephone, by the help of Helios the sun, she appealed to have Zeus to have her return. Zeus relented. However, while Persephone was in the underworld, she ate a pomegranate. Because of this simple act, she was forced to remain in the underworld for 1 month for every seed that she ate. When in the underworld, however, Persephone wasn't simply a prisoner. On the contrary, she served willingly as its queen. In art, when alone, she is often carrying a scepter or a sheaf of wheat. It is shown with her mother. If shown with her mother, she usually carries a 4-tipped torch, while her mother carries a scepter and a sheaf. Where else do we see this symbolism of a sheaf of wheat? This myth is said to explain the seasons of the year, as it's winter when she's in Hades and it's summer when she's not. The story of Persephone isn't the only parallel to mythology in the ritual. If we think back to the dismembering of Jephthah, we can't help but think of the Egyptian myth of Osiris. In his ancient Egyptian myth, he was killed by his brother Set and cut up into pieces. These pieces were scattered and buried throughout Egypt. Osiris's wife Isis searched all over and eventually found all but one piece. She fastened a substitute and attached it to his body. She reanimated him and laid with him, after which he took his place as the lord of the underworld. The result of this union was the birth of Horus, the Egyptian god of the sky. We see reference to this myth in Freemasonry through the all-seeing eye, which is reminiscent of the Eye of Horus. The Eye of Horus is said to be a unit of measurement. When broken into 6 pieces, represents the 5 senses of human nature, along with a 6th sense, that being the sense of thought. Of interesting note is the fact that the pupil representing thought is not always found in the Eye of Horus. This reminds us that of the square and compasses, which also does not contain the G. It also might remind us of the point within the circle and with the point representing the eye. We also see this through the 40th, 7th problem of Euclid, in which Osiris, Isis, and Horus are all a different side of a triangle, with Horus being the answer to the equation. All of this, however, is mere speculation on my part. But that being said, I think it provides an interesting contemplation for the Mason who chooses to compare and contrast the two traditions. These myths are most important in Freemasonry because it's believed that they were the stories taught in the ancient mystery schools from which Freemasonry is at least in part modeled. These schools, like Freemasonry, were responsible for the noble art of initiation. You may be thinking that these stories are from long ago. They're from a simpler time. They don't really apply today. But they are just as relevant today as they were in ancient times. At the beginning of this talk, I mentioned the hero's journey, or the monomyth as it's sometimes known. Variations of the same story have been told for generations. All of these characters follow at least a part of the hero's journey, as described by Joseph Campbell. I think we've discovered that they share at least some similarity with each other. But what about modern characters? What could some modern characters have in common? Let's discuss 2 modern heroes who I believe exemplify these same concepts: Iron Man and Harry Potter. In examining more modern characters, perhaps we, with our modern minds, might be able to better understand the concepts taught in the ritual. To begin with, both Tony Stark and Harry Potter are unlikely heroes. Tony Stark actually says, quote, "I'm not the hero type. Clearly, with this laundry list of character defects, all the mistakes I've made, largely public," end quote. Harry Potter's an orphan boy who lives in a cupboard under the stairs. How do they become heroes? What even makes a hero? Henry Miller once said, "The ordinary man is involved in action. The hero acts. An immense difference." What does that mean? At its core, it describes a psychological concept of the locus of control. This concept was developed by Julian B. Rotter in the 1950s. He argues that people are either oriented to believe that they are subject to outside influences or that they have control of their own life. This is a very important concept in Freemasonry, which is first addressed in the ritual with the introduction of the concept of free will. A man is not allowed to become a Mason unless it's of his own agency. His first step must be free from influence. The question that we contemplate as Masons and humans, however, is whether free will truly exists. When we meet Tony Stark, he's living a life of luxury, but not really of his own actions. He's going through the motions. He's CEO of Stark Industries, but he's mostly a figurehead, and the company and his image are largely controlled by others. He doesn't mind, though, because he's more interested in partying and living the Playboy lifestyle. When we meet Harry Potter, he's completely beholden to his aunt and uncle. He is basically a male version of Cinderella. They both have strong external locuses of control. They're both who the world lets them or has conditioned them to be. Even Tony, who to the casual observer appears to do what he wants, is not exercising his free will. In Masonic terms, he's a libertine. How do these 2 characters become heroes? In its simplest term, the monomyth or hero's journey can be separated into 3 distinct parts: separation, initiation, and return. We see this in the story of Persephone. We see this in the myth of Osiris. We see this in our own lives. To begin their journey, a hero needs to make a choice to separate or leave the mundane world and embark on an adventure. They often refuse this call to adventure at first, and then later are compelled compelled due to an outside threat to their world or an invitation. Jephthah was asked to lead an army. Boaz was asked to redeem Ruth. Tony Stark was kidnapped by a terrorist group, and Harry received an invitation to attend Hogwarts. After crossing this threshold, they next go through an initiation or a transformation. This is a direct result of the friends and enemies that they meet and the trials and lessons that they learn. At the very bottom depth of this stage of the journey, our hero faces the main villain. This character is often a reflection of who the hero is or can be if he follows a darker path. Jephthah fought the Ammonites. Boaz dealt with the other kinsmen who gladly shunned his responsibility. Tony Stark fought a number of villains, but the greatest of these was Thanos. Thanos was trying to reintegrate all 6 of the Infinity Stones into the gauntlet that he wore on his left hand. Again, we see the number 6. Are you starting to see a theme with this? These stones corresponded to an aspect of the universe. They are the mind, power, reality, soul, space, and time stones. When combined, they give Thanos the power to annihilate half the universe. To obtain the Soul Stone and thereby finally gain his power, all he had to do was sacrifice his daughter Gamora by throwing her off of a cliff. By Avengers Endgame, Tony has come a long way from the young playboy that he had been when we first meet him. By Endgame, he married Pepper and they have a 4-year-old child named Morgan. Morgan is shown to be intelligent and crafty just like her father, who's trying his best to be the father that his never was. When the Avengers first find Thanos in Endgame, we learn that in using the stones, he permanently damaged his left arm with the gauntlet. There's always a price to be paid in these kind of things. It's just a matter of who pays it. In the end, Tony pays it. He sacrificed himself to save the world, or rather to redeem it. Masculine energy is all about competition, and feminine energy is about cooperation. Only by being a part of something bigger can Tony realize his true potential. He finds this in his family and in the Avengers. And when he dies, he lives on in the promise of his daughter, the idea of Iron Man, the Avengers, and the world that he saved. Harry Potter ultimately wins by realizing a similar lesson. Throughout his story, he fights a number of villains, which are all in the service of Voldemort. Voldemort's an evil wizard who is intent on ridding the world of muggles, or non-magical people. Ironically, he was conceived by his mother using a love potion on his father, which is reminiscent of the story of Lot and his daughters. He tried to achieve immortality by separating his soul into 7 pieces by creating 6 Horcruxes, again with the number 6. He tries to reintegrate these together into one body to come back from the dead. Does this remind us of the Eye of Horus broken into its 6 pieces? Is this why J.K. Rowling called it a Horcrux? Is her wordplay designed to make us think of the literal translation as a cross of Horus? The definition of crux is mid-17th century, denoting a representation of a cross, chiefly in crux ansata, ankh, literally cross with a handle, from the Latin, literally cross. This also may inspire one to think of the crook and flail often associated with Osiris. The definition in modern times refers to either, quote, the decisive or most important issue at hand, or a particular point of difficulty. The online etymology dictionary says that the figurative use for a central difficulty is older in English than the literal sense. Perhaps it's because from the Latin crux interpretum, a point in a text that is impossible to interpret, the literal meaning of which is something like a crossroads of interpreters. But Century Dictionary ascribes it to the cross as an instrument of torture, hence anything that puzzles or vexes in a high degree. Harry ends up at the crossroads between life and death. He stands there as a living Horcrux. He ultimately defeats Voldemort by sacrificing himself, which at least in part causes Voldemort's curse to rebound off Harry, killing himself instead. For years, other wizards had laid down their lives to protect Harry and what he represented. But in the end, as the Buddha said, no one saves us but ourselves. No one can, and no one may. We ourselves must walk the path. The final stage in a hero's journey is the return, where the hero brings back the treasure that they won to the place whence they came, and uses it to make the world a better place. As a great friend once told me, real heroes don't wear masks. They are actively a part of their community and sacrifice themselves freely to save it. Jephthah in the end fails in his quest. He's not a hero. Harry Potter, Boaz, and Tony Stark all live on through their family. This may not really seem important, but it is. This imitates the sacred marriage that we described in the Osiris myth. One of the best ways to honor the gods is to imitate them. These heroes all live on through the act of reunion and creation. They achieve immortality through others, and the children that they create are the treasure that they bring back into the world. At the beginning of this talk, I promised that there would be practical applications, and there will be, but they won't come easy, and it's something that requires true character and perseverance, but it's also something that I can't give you. We each have to take that first step and apply the lessons that we learn in our ritual about sacrifice and redemption in our own lives. We need to find and reintegrate all the parts of ourselves that we've lost over the years. We have to strive to find the golden mean or the harmony between opposites in each and every moment of our lives. Henry David Thoreau is quoted as saying, "Men will lie on their backs and talk about the fall of man and never make an effort to get up." Each of us has to get up. No one saves us but ourselves. We have to once again say, "I do." We have to follow our conductor and fear no danger. We have to live respected and die regretted. Only then will we be a hero. Get back to the other screen here. So at the end, this talk originally ended here with that picture that I had up, which somehow on my screen share I put down, but you guys all saw it. So the man in that picture is a friend of mine named Bill Barnett, and he died shortly before I gave this talk. Bill was a big mentor of mine. So I thought it fitting to put his picture in a talk on the hero's journey because I thought he was a hero. And I'm going to share a little bit of why I thought he was a hero with you tonight. So Bill Barnett, as a young man, went to Boston University in the 60s. And one of his fellow Boston University alumni decided to go down to Selma, Alabama. And Bill decided to follow him against his father's wishes. So Bill went down there mostly to teach people how to pass the voting test, because at that time you had to take a test to be able to vote. And they were designed so that certain classes of people couldn't vote. So Bill went down to use his training as a teacher. He was a history professor. He went down to use that to help these men and women learn to vote, or earn, be able to exercise their right to vote. So while he was down there, a white limousine pulls up one day next to Martin Luther King. And a man gets out of the limousine and asks him if Dr. King, if he would mind if the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts marched with him. Of course, Dr. King said that was fine. And they marched together for a while. And that's kind of the end of then that guy went back home to Massachusetts after, at some point. When I first heard of Selma when I was a kid, I kind of thought they went for a walk, because that's kind of what I got out of the history books. But when I sat there having a scotch with Bill one night and asked him about Selma, and he talked about his friend who was a woman that was taking 2 kids to school that got a shotgun blast through her head because people didn't think she should be bringing those kids to school, I learned what it was really about as he told me this with a scotch in his hand and a tear in his eye. And that's when I learned what Selma, Alabama was all about. And Bill would be a hero to me if that was the end of his story, but it's not. Bill moved on to, he's taught at a college in Puerto Rico after that. And during his time at that college, not only did he meet his wife, but he, the governor of Puerto Rico at the time, decided that nobody, if they weren't from Puerto Rico, that they couldn't go to college there anymore. Seems like a reasonable thing on its face, but what Bill realized was that a lot of his students were from South America, and they were from communist countries. And if they went back home after being in Puerto Rico, which was a part of the United States, that they were going to get executed. So Bill decided that he would put out a article in the paper about what they were doing and about what the real repercussions were about, of their actions. And he wrote a letter to that lieutenant governor, who at this point in time was the assistant attorney general of the United States. And he waited it out. He hid the kids out in his dorm room, or his room, his college provided, apartment. And that man did intervene and get those kids to be able to still go to school there, so they didn't go home to a death sentence. So Bill left that. After all that, Bill left in the trunk of a car. They rushed him out to the airport so he could go home. And later on, as he told me this story, he told me that was his Masonic hero, because that man was a Massachusetts Freemason. You might know that man because his name was Elliot Richardson, and he told Richard Nixon to go pound sand when Nixon told him to fire a bunch of guys in the middle of the night. I don't bring this up because of politics. I'm not talking about the politics of any situation. I'm talking about basic human decency, and I'm talking about men who put their lives on the line, their careers on the line, when it was the right thing to do. And the reason that I add this part to this talk now is because I realize that while Harry Potter and Iron Man are cool, they're not real people. They're not men in our society, and they don't have a real impact in our day-to-day lives. But men like Bill Barnett and men like Elliot Richardson do have an impact in our everyday lives. And I don't think they became a hero. Bill Barnett didn't leave to go to Selma, Alabama, and neither did Elliot Richardson. Those men, what I mean by that is they didn't leave to go to Selma, Alabama as we know it, because Selma, Alabama, it wasn't a thing then, right? It was just a place that they were going to do the right thing. And so I think that when Bill Barnett and Elliot Richardson became a hero was when Bill Barnett bought a bus ticket and set his foot on a bus and took that first step up the stairs onto that bus and went down to Selma and risked his life and risked his father's anger and risked everything else that he had in the world so that he could go down there and do what he thought was the right thing. And so what I leave you with this talk is the same thing I said in the beginning. And it's a challenge I take upon myself every time I listen that I give this talk, that I hope I do the same thing, that tomorrow when you have the opportunity to take a step on a foot on the bus or to reach out a hand and help somebody out or to just do a kind thing and all of this craziness that's going on, to work to help society come together rather than be ripped apart. That's what I think our goal as Masons and as men is to be the hero that the world needs today. Matt, thank you for having me, and I hope you guys appreciated the talk.
Mike, that was fantastic, and thank you for sharing about Brother Barnett. That was actually very, very touching, and I think that exemplifies really what Masonry stands for. We look back at our Masonic legacy and history, and we see brave men who stood in the face of what was either convenient or what may have been popular opinion, but they stood for what was right, even though that was a hard thing, and even put themselves in danger by doing so. I'm not saying that anyone here needs to put themselves in danger. Hopefully, you're never in that situation. But you look at some of our revolutionary brothers, Paul Revere, the ones who signed the Declaration of Independence. I mean, that was treason. Um, but they did it because it's the right thing to do. Uh, I love the fact that you brought up or tied that hero's journey into Masonry, because our Masonic degrees really are an exemplification of the hero's journey that Joseph Campbell wrote about. It's an archetype that goes back thousands of years. It's so consistent. You watch every superhero movie pretty much ever made, and they all follow that. And I want to go back to one key part of that hero's journey. There's a part near the beginning of the journey where the hero needs some kind of help or assistance. Superman had Lois Lane, right? And I think we find that here in our Masonic fraternity with our brothers supporting us on our journey. But Mike, I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, you're right. We always do need that help, and even in that story with Bill, like that, he had the help of Elliot Richardson, and I think the lesson, right, when you watch Harry Potter, the lesson of Harry Potter is that he can't go it alone, right? Same with Iron Man. Like, Tony Stark can't go it alone. The whole second movie, he's just basically like an immature kid, like running around there doing stupid stuff and breaking stuff and getting drunk. And then he realized that that's not really, that's not going to get it done. And you can almost see it, like you could sense it, right? When the first movie first came out, you knew he was sacrificing himself. There was no better person to sacrifice themselves in the Avengers than Tony Stark. So yeah, I hope that answered what.
Yeah, I love that. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments for Mike?
Right, wonderful brother Jarzabek. I just regret that I'm joining a North Carolina Zoom call to see my kindred brother from Massachusetts in the first talk I've heard you give. That was incredibly, that was an incredible talk. And I hope to talk with you personally soon about more of that, because that was really inspirational. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, and thank you. And it's good to see you again, Jeremy. Again, like, Jeremy and I don't live that far away from each other, but we haven't seen each other in months because of all this, and it's good to see him online here.
And let's see, does anyone over on Facebook? We have several viewers over on Facebook. So if you have any questions, please type them into the comments, and I'll be happy to ask for you.
I don't take it offensively that people don't ask me questions, because I realize so far that I put so much in this presentation that, like, people are kind of just as digesting usually, and kind of thinking about it, which is good, right? I mean, I'm not an academic, right? This is what contemplations I've made and connections that I've made to certain things. I'm not saying they're true. Like, I hope you guys go investigate it for yourself and make your own connections. But I think if I watch, if I go watch a movie and I make a connection on Freemasonry, then that's huge.
I would absolutely agree with that. And if there's anyone who has not read The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell, pick it up. It is absolutely worth the read. I've read it a couple of times myself. Campbell was not a Mason, but as Mike has pointed out, you read through the book and you are just hit with so many Masonic principles and ideas and archetypes. It's really unbelievable. But you really do see how Masonry is kind of a microcosm of this greater story and really defines who we are. Mike, I'll throw this in there, not to get too philosophical, but we'll go down that rabbit hole a little bit. There are people that go through life without wanting to change, without wanting to be better than who they are. They're content with the status quo, and they live their entire lives in that field. And then there are those who seek to better themselves. They seek to make the world a better place. They seek to help others. And by doing that, they continue to go through that hero's journey. That cycle repeats over and over. And part of the hero's journey that Campbell talked about was the hero, after going through his journey, returns back to his normal world. But he is in a different place because of that journey. He's never going back to the person he was before. And then a new journey begins. So you have, a sequel or whatever the case may be, and it just expounds and continue to grow. I think that's at the heart of Masonry, is that growth, that continual movement to become better. Not that we are perfect people by any means, except for myself, but but not that we're perfect people, but we strive for perfection. And I think that's one of the huge lessons of Masonry. Please feel free to disagree with me. I might be totally off there.
Well, I don't disagree. And I think an important part of that is we believe in reincarnation, right? Well, we believe in immortality. I won't say that we believe in it. People would argue me on that point, right? But these ancient cultures that these mysteries came from did believe in reincarnation. So that whole picking the story back up at the other top of it and things being cyclical in nature instead of linear, it shouldn't be a surprise that that's how these stories work, because that's how they thought of life, right? Like they were obtaining virtue as much as they could in one lifetime, and then they go back to the bottom and come back up. And, as they incarnate again, they hopefully add a little more virtue on the next time until they can finally break that chain. So I think that's kind of what we're seeing here, is that was a lot of the earlier cultures. That's what they were representing by those stories.
Would you say that the in terms of I'm thinking of other authors and other sort of saga tales. You have Tolkien in his Lord of the Rings trilogy talks about the story, and that people fall into the story and then fall out again, and that the role of a person really is to continue the fight against evil, or the desire to improve. To continue it on, you have to mentor other people as opposed to wait for your turn at reincarnation.
Yeah, and I think what I'm hearing from you there kind of reminds me of like the Bodhisattva, right?
Yeah.
Where they kind of wait. For those of you that aren't maybe familiar with that, the Bodhisattva in some Buddhist traditions is an enlightened being that delays their enlightenment so that they can help others.
Exactly.
Go ahead, Parth.
It kind of reminds me of what Matt was talking about earlier. If you remember the end of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, right? The end of the film trilogy ends with the idea of Frodo realizing that there is no going back to the old way of things, that the experience has fundamentally changed his being, and you know, to the point where, like, you know, you can even examine it in terms of his relationship with Sam, but that's the whole, and that ties very, I think, poignantly into the idea that you mentioned with the Bodhisattva, right? He saved the Shire, but it wasn't for himself.
Mm.
He saves it for Sam and for for everyone else.
Yeah, and do you think maybe that, you know, you guys are gonna hate me, but I've read The Hobbit, and I have never been through the rest of Tolkien. Like, I don't know why it's just never. I've never picked it back up. I've read a lot of other stuff, and for some reason, I never picked it back up. But it kind of, you know, some traditions kind of look at that idea of marriage and birth. Like Horus is Osiris in a lot of ways, right? Like he's a continuation of it, a better, you know, I don't want to say a better version, but we'll say a different version, a more progressed version of Osiris in some ways. He even has part, I think he gets his eye in some of the myths. So I think you can't go back because it doesn't exist anymore, right? Because that you've transcended that nature and you're into a different nature.
Right, and that's like straight out of Jung, you know. That kind of, I think, harkens back to Carl Jung and a lot of his psychoanalysis work, in the sense that he says that, like, anytime that you examine somebody who's recovering from a trauma, right, and essentially a hero's journey is a traumatic experience for whatever hero, right? In the beginning, you establish, it's a 3-part act, or a 3-act play, right? You establish the characters, the character then goes and finds the dragon, defeats the dragon, and then returns home. And he says, Jung's analysis of that entire hero's journey says that, like, the idea basically of you trying to return to that old person, that old person is gone. They don't exist anymore.
Right.
It's the Ulysses, the tale of Ulysses, and how when he returns from his journeys, his curse journey, he comes back and everything has changed and it'll never be the same again. And it is a recurring theme, and I think Campbell discusses that as well in when he talks about some of the cultures and their initiatic rites with youth and using caves and that sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely, and that's definitely that's also a recurring motif, right? Like with that, and it. For those, I know we're hitting on Campbell a lot. I have 4 books, the Masks of God series. Like the others, the Hero's Journey stuff is great. The Masks of God is like most of the people in this group that's like right up their alley. I mean, that is like basically, let me take the whole entire history of the world and explore it in one lens. I mean, the thing's got to be like this thick when you put them all together, you know. But they're amazing books, and like, I don't think I can dog ear like every page, like, because that's what I would want to do, you know. But yeah, he's got some really great stuff, and to be that man's mind, right? Our friend Paul in Massachusetts, Paul Orr. I don't know if any of you know him, but he actually took a class with Campbell at Columbia. I'm like totally jealous of that, you know, because I really like what Campbell did, and I love Star Wars, and Campbell's very responsible for Star Wars. So, in a lot of ways, influentially, and later on, actually being Lucas's friend. So,
if anyone's interested, there is at least it was on Netflix. I assume it's still there. A series of interviews that Bill Moyer did with Joseph Campbell shortly before he passed away. And I would say it's a Cliff Notes version of Hero with a Thousand Faces, but it's certainly worth watching and hearing Joseph Campbell put that into his own words and explain that. But Mike, something that occurred to me during your presentation is heroes don't see themselves as heroes. They're just doing what they feel like they're supposed to be doing. They don't require any kind of recognition or praise. And that has a lot to do with our first degree in Masonry, I think. Just the very art or very act of being able to subdue our passions, to learn to control our world around us, not to be a part of that material world or not to allow that material world to control us, but just to exist in it. It has a lot to do with shedding the ego and the false self. And I do see that in all these heroes or archetypes that we've spoken about. There's a humility there. It's not about praise. It's not about ego. It's about just doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm trying to think of the quote that I had. I think it was in a book. I just recently bought a book, The Heroes of the Greek mythology, or Heroes of the Greeks. It's Carl Kareny. Carl Kareny was counterpart of Jung. I think he wrote with Jung at one point. I think they co-authored a book together. And it's amazing. I just started it, but I got like 6 books going right now. So, but they kind of talk about that, where that like the hero has that central focus, right? Like there's just like this true north compass of like, this is the right thing to do, in some ways. And they're just pointed in that direction. I think it's amazing. It's not surprising to me, but it's amazing. What movie can you think of in recent memory that was a popular movie that either wasn't based on a myth or, stole a part of a myth or just outright was a myth?
Oh man, Mike, you actually you sparked something. You had that slide that said, "Get up, you son of a bitch."
Yeah.
So funny story. My 4-year-old is in love with Spider-Man, and so we've been watching Into the Spider-Verse. And I grew up a fairly nerdy kid, but the one hero I could never get behind was Spider-Man. Because the whole premise of Spider-Man was, with great power comes great responsibility. And I always felt like I had great responsibility, but the power part was always really lost on me. And the new Into the Spider-Verse takes a brand new approach to Spider-Man. And the new sort of branding was, it's not about how many times you fall down, but are you willing to get back up? And that like resonated with me on such a much deeper level that I was actually able to like get behind Spider-Man finally after like existing for 30 years.
Yeah. I think I'm with you. Like, I always like the anti-heroes for some reason. I don't know why. Like, Spider-Man never really did it for me. Batman did, I guess. I never really liked Superman because I can never trust a man that wears his underwear on the outside of his pants. Like,
well, I mean, the whole Superman idea, it harkens back to like Kill Bill, right? Like Kill Bill Volume 2. At the very end of that, right? It's like the reason Bill loves Superman is not because his alter ego is Superman, right? It's because the alter ego that he puts on is Clark Kent. So like he full well knows he's a hero all the time, and he has to put on this alter ego of Clark Kent.
yeah. That's interesting. I guess I never really thought of it that way, but I like that. That's a good.
Yeah, I mean, he's an interesting hero in that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got to tell you, Superman has always been my favorite hero, always. And the fact that he wears his underwear on the outside of his pants, it just shows that he's a forward thinker. He's not afraid of public opinion or what people think of him. He's just going to do his own thing. Um, you did hit on some really good points there, and especially with Parth bringing up Spider-Man and some of the other heroes. But you look at other movies or other books, they don't necessarily have to be superhero movies. They could be any movie. It could be a biopic or something like that. And they all follow that same motif. In fact, a lot of movies will exaggerate certain things or insert fictional elements in a biography, rearrange timelines just to make it fit that mold, to force it into that mold of the hero's journey. One film that comes to mind is the movie about Queen and Freddie Mercury, Bohemian Rhapsody. A good chunk of that movie was completely fictionalized. The timelines were completely taken out of order, but it was designed to fit the mold of the hero's journey. Otherwise, it wouldn't have worked as a film. So we see that over and over and over. So not just superhero movies, but really just any movie at all. Have you ever seen a movie where the protagonist was already perfect or already where he was supposed to be at the beginning of the film and never really developed, never really changed? There have been some movies made like that, and they were flops.
Yeah.
Because they didn't resonate with people.
Yeah, I think so The Mandalorian this is one thing that comes to mind for me is like The Mandalorian last year was good, right? I really liked it, but this year they kind of they made him grow as a person, right? They made him a real character, and they made some of the other characters. I'm not gonna ruin it for anybody that hasn't seen it yet, but they made some of the other characters that we loved from 30 years ago. They made them real characters. They really fleshed them out. I mean, my favorite character in the series, they fleshed him out. I mean, he started kicking ass and taking names. But yeah, I think you're right. I think there always needs to be that aspect of growth, right?
Right. And I think, but when you get to that, right, like one of the that's what makes a story intriguing, right? Like fairy tales, they don't tell us that dragons exist. We know dragons exist. Fairy tales tell us that dragons can be defeated.
That's an awesome point.
Brother Matt, you just connected a few dots for me there, talking about the Bohemians, I never actually thought of the Boaz story as a sacrifice and a transitional sacrifice. Some time ago, I was reading Pappus's Tarot of the Bohemians, and at the start of it, it goes into explaining about the tetragrammaton, the Yod He Vahe, and the symbolization of the second He. And what Pappus states is the second He may be compared to a grain of wheat, relatively to the ear. The Trinity, or manifest, of Yod He Vav exerts all its activity in the production of a grain of wheat. I'm reading from Pappus's book here, or second He. But this grain of wheat is only the transition between the ear which gave it birth and the ear to which it will itself give birth in the following generation. It is the transition between one generation and another which it contains in germ. This is why the second He is a Yod in germ, and you're referring to Horus being Osiris, and the whole sacrificial transition. It's just connected a little dot for me. I don't know anybody could enlighten me more on this. But the symbology of the grain of wheat through all the stories, and how Pappas identifies it as a transition, a sacrificial transition from one to the other. I'm just wondering what your thoughts on this are. Did that make any sense at all?
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I would think a friend of mine and I had a long conversation about these kind of things, and the term that we like to use in a fun way is speculative farming, right? Like, we know about speculative masonry, but there's this whole like aspect of speculative farming and the idea of, I mean, these were the heroes, right? In some ways, like the guy that created the plow was immortalized in ancient times. In fact, when I added some of the stuff tonight, I added some of the Osiris stuff tonight, or more the Eye of Horus stuff tonight. That was the thing I've been working on. And when I got to that, I started thinking about the crook and flail that they have, right? Which she's crossed this idea of this cross. It's a Southern Cross. It's probably an astronomical symbol if I was to really start exploring it, I'm guessing. But you get the idea of a flail, and we look at the flail and think it's like a whip to beat somebody with, probably. I mean, I never really gave it much thought, but in when I started looking at it, the flail was actually used to thresh wheat. So you have this idea of a shepherding hook and a tool that's used to thresh wheat. And the pharaoh uses those as his symbols crossed. Those were crossed over his chest as his symbols. So I think that aspect of, I kind of think that it's about the cultivation, right? Like, this is the difference between civilization where you're eating like berries and whatever you can find in the woods, or you're cultivating land and you're making society out of it. So I think that cultivation of wheat and that seed, that the life cycle of a seed is what we're talking about, in a very important way. I think it's probably, sometimes I get the idea that the easier things, the things we want to look at all the complicated stuff, and like, I can do like this, like some of the sacred geometry, and like I do this trigonometry and all this other stuff, and I figured out the mathematical idea of the universe. And sometimes I think you take something like a seed and you go like, man. In fact, when I went to Pasadena and I first gave this talk, there was actually a part I had in there where I took one of the roses from the side of the road, because we were in Pasadena, and I crushed it because I remember that story of the Buddha where he holds up a flower, and I'm probably going to mispronounce it, but I think it was Ananda. Like, he becomes enlightened just looking at the flower because he gets it, right?
Yeah.
So you have this idea of this transmission of enlightenment through looking at a flower, and through the cultivation of, or the growth and the life cycle of horticulture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yes, and can I say that was a fantastic presentation, actually, and your slides were just top shelf.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
I want to get some tips off you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
It's an ADD brain. Like, just, I put the slides together and I'm like, there's like 135 of them or something like that. And I'm like, holy cow. But, it's not the slide. I'm not going to explain every slide. So I think it's cool because it gives somebody a visual reference point to kind of float in and out as I'm saying some of the deeper stuff. Like, if your mind's just like shutting down, you have the pictures to kind of like, you can go back and forth between them, I think.
Well, that's a good point. You actually, when it comes to presentations, so many people now are communicating in emojis. And the reason why is because you can, communicate a thought quicker through an image than you can through words. So, that's interesting. I do want to say, Brother Paul over on Facebook has an interesting question. He said, why do we think that the most enduring world myths are personified in an imperfect hero? Is it simply to engineer a sense of identification with the hero, or something more? I'd love to hear you. I have an opinion on that, but I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Okay.
I kind of think that there's this idea of lack, right? Like when you get the widow's son idea, I had a talk a while, like a long time ago that wasn't fully as developed as this, but you get the idea of lack. So whatever tradition that you come from, you get this idea of God as in his whole self, separating himself, right? He is imperfect. Like God is, when God becomes manifest, when God goes down from the infinite, from the beginning, he becomes imperfect, or they become imperfect, however you want to say it. So I think that's part of it, right? Like, or you get the idea of the world soul, and the world soul is broken up a little bit, and so it's a part of that soul trying to get back to the whole. So, I mean, that's my kind of sense for it. I mean, if that makes sense.
I agree with you. My thought on that, I thought was a very interesting question. So, Brother Paul, thank you for asking that. My thought is that these heroes are imperfect because they are designed to represent us as being imperfect, but striving for that perfection or striving for that achievement. If the hero was perfect to begin with, we would not be able to relate to the hero. It would mean nothing. And that goes back to what we were saying earlier. If you have a movie where the hero or the protagonist is perfect at the beginning and never changes, it's going to be a dull movie. It's really not going to keep your attention. You just can't relate to it. So I think that is a big part of that. And Brother Parth sent me a message. We'll make this the last comment of the evening because we are running a little late. But Parth said, "Are you ready to go down the rabbit hole?" So Parth, go right in, brother. Now I got to hear this.
Brother Mike, so my question for the evening is, have you done any comparative work between the works of Campbell and Fraser, James Fraser, of the Golden Bough?
No, I haven't. So I've been studying the Orphic tradition, and I've been trying to go to as much of the source documents as possible, and so Fraser wasn't one of the ones that I used. But I think there's probably some merit in it. But I want to hear the rabbit hole.
The rabbit hole really kind of goes down that whole Fraser concept. But you bring up Orphic myths, right? And it sort of all, Fraser connects deeply to that concept, whether it be, I mean, a lot of Fraser's work deals with the concepts of sort of magic and, I mean, it's a broad sort of idea, and the thing is that you find that a lot of the same story elements, right? Because we're talking about story elements here, that show up in Campbell also show up in Fraser. So, you know, I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head. Can't particularly think of one right now. But perhaps this can be something that we discuss a little further.
Yeah.
Once I sort of flesh out some more thoughts. But I was just wondering if you had any insight or anyone else ever. I kind of watched all the video, and as soon as I said James Fraser, about 3 or 4 of your heads all nodded at the same time. So
I have both books side by side in my bookshelf, the Golden Bough and the Hero, Joseph Campbell's book. And I get what you're talking about, Brother Parth. Almost as if one feeds off the other. Yes, I'm sure Joseph Campbell has read James Fraser's books and got quite a bit of his.
that's not your. It's not your Scottish heritage seeping through there, is it?
No, not really. No, it's yes, but I am sure Joseph Campbell got quite a lot of his bulk around the stories from James Fraser's The Golden Bough.
Yeah, they were definitely in the same sandbox, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
for sure.
I think if I could close this, Matt,
Yeah,
the
please.
one thing I've learned a lot over the last year when I was with some of the studies that I was making was I love Campbell, and I think sometimes so. There's two ways of thought about this, but Campbell is sometimes looked at as a guy that says that all myths are the same, and what I've learned is that that's not true, and I think that might be an oversimplification when you dig into his deeper works. I don't think that's what he's saying. That each myth is important to take the locality into your idea of like understanding a myth. You can't just say because this myth had this and this myth had this that they're the same thing, because they're not. They may be similar, but they're not the same. And I think that's really important. And I let John seems really excited about this, so I think maybe we'll let him say it better than I did.
No, I totally agree with you. It's similar, not the same, but consistently similar across cultures. And I think that's an important thing that Campbell brought out in his writings, where he talks about the similarities between the different cultures, but that they are different, and that there is a base in human culture that's there that makes these myths valuable for everybody.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I'm glad you guys got so much out of this. This is the longest I've ever talked afterwards. Like usually people, I think it's probably the group that's here, but like I said, usually it's not this great it's not this thorough of a conversation afterwards. So I appreciate this. This was amazing.
Yeah, I think at the beginning the comments or questions were a little slow to come. Brothers were processing that information, but I think you really touched on something there, Mike. It's really generated some interest, and I'm sure this conversation will continue as brothers, continue to digest everything that you packed in there. I mean, that was absolutely phenomenal, and I can't thank you enough again for being with us tonight, sacrificing your time, and again, to tell us about your hero, Brother Barnett, and just share that amazing presentation. I hope to have you back again. That was just fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. You're welcome, and thank you. I always love hanging out with you guys. Get to see a lot of friends. All you guys that are here, I consider a lot of you friends. Those that I ever met. I don't think there's any of you left. I met John at the beginning and Steve now. So, but it's good to see you guys again. This is great. So, and I'm on Messenger. So if anyone wants to hit me up on Messenger or whatever, I'll be glad to continue the conversation.
Sounds fantastic. All right. Well, I'm going to stop recording because I know Parth is about to burst with what he really, really, really wants to say. Next week, our guest is going to be Brother Randy Sanders. That's going to be Tuesday. Tuesday the 19th at 8 p.m. Eastern. So please, for those that are left on here or the ones that watch this presentation later, please join us for that, because Randy's just going to blow it out of the water, do a great job. And I appreciate everybody tuning in. I appreciate everyone on Facebook for your comments and questions. Again, it was a great presentation, great discussion. And Mike, we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.